There is an invisible line that runs across America from north to south. It's called the Continental Divide. And it actually stretches much further than the continental United States. It actually goes north, about as far north as you can go, up into Alaska, at Cape Prince of Wales, Alaska. Then it follows down through Canada, into the United States, down through Mexico, down through Central America, down into South America, and then it moves all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, which is literally at the very tip down at the end of South America, down at the Cape Horn. Now, in the United States, it moves through 5 states. It enters into Montana, kind of squiggles across the border here of Montana and Idaho, then down into Colorado, into New Mexico. It basically follows the peak of the Rocky Mountains as it's moving down through the United States, and then down when it gets south into New Mexico, it's following the Sierra Madre Mountains. It's called the Continental Divide, but actually it could be called the hydrological divide of our country, because depending on where a drop of rain falls on this line will determine where that drop of rain is going to land. I mean, literally millimeters apart from each other. If the rain drop falls just to the west of that line, what will happen is it will eventually end up in the Pacific Ocean. And if it falls just to the east of that line, that drop of rain will eventually wind up in the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it's serious. Just literally a millimeter, a micromillimeter apart, will send this water in completely different directions. And when you think about it, it's just an amazing phenomenon. Amazing that such a little bit of a difference can make such a widespread difference in the long run. But it does. And really, this truth applies to us. It's really kind of a metaphor of our lives, because here's the truth. It matters where you land. Why? Because when you land in the wrong spot, you will be moving in the wrong direction, and that direction can take you a zillion miles from maybe where you actually want to be. We've had moments, all of us have had these moments, these watershed moments in our lives, those times when the path of your life was severely altered simply because of a decision you made. You made a decision about a career or about a relationship. And honestly, the decisions come in all forms. I'm going to experiment with this. I'm going to move there. I'm going to buy that. I'm going to take on this debt. I'm going to volunteer for that. I'm sure you're like me. You can look back over your life and you can see that some of these decisions have had huge ramifications on where you ended up. There are friends that I have, even friends from Bible college, that made decisions when they were 17 or 18, and those decisions took them in directions that they had no intentions of going. They made a choice, and it was life-altering. Watershed. It actually became defining for who they are and where they went. What it means is this: life is not just filled with a bunch of willy-nilly, seemingly meaningless decisions. No, there are some decisions that point you in a direction that are watershed. Watershed, and that they'll get you to where you don't want to go, or maybe where you do want to go. These watershed decisions have sent our lives moving in one direction or another. And the biggest watershed moment in all of our lives will be who we determine is going to be God of our lives. Who is going to sit on the throne of our lives? Now, as we begin this series, really, this is the question. Who is God? Who is God? And to help you here, I want to put two thoughts in front of you. Draw two pictures for you, two definitions for you. And I want you to write them down. And I want you to take some time this week to think and to meditate. The first word is this: theism. And to help us here, I want to give you a definition. The theism is the determination to believe in God and walk in his path. In Exodus 19, the children of Israel came to Mount Sinai. It had been a long, long, long haul to get there. The family of Israel had been living in Egypt for 400 years. A great relationship had turned sour as another Pharaoh rose up and didn't remember Joseph and didn't remember his family. And through that, he became afraid, and suddenly the Israelites were slaves. They cried out for deliverance. And in response, several hundred years later, after their crying, God sends them a deliverer. His name is Moses. And Moses is going to come, stand before Pharaoh, and say, "Let my people go so they may worship me." Pharaoh refused. So for a year, God poured out judgment upon these people, upon the land of Egypt. It came in the form of plagues, 10 of them, and eventually Pharaoh relented, and Pharaoh let Israel go. They left Egypt. And as they're leaving, they watched the Lord part the Red Sea, and in the process of that, watched the Lord drown the entire Egyptian army in the sea. After 400 years in Egypt, they were on their way to the promised land. The land that had been promised to Abraham like 600 years earlier, all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. It was a day of celebration. It was a day of joy. All of this waiting for 600 years has finally come into fruition. But before they turned northeast to the promised land, God wanted to turn them south and took them into the Sinai Peninsula. God had a watershed moment planned for his people, an important decision that he wanted them to contemplate, that he wanted them to make, that he wanted them to commit to. At Sinai, two important things happened. One, God established his relationship with Israel. And second, God very purposefully laid out the rules and the boundaries for this relationship. Now, this all took place in Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus 19, they arrive at Sinai. Exodus 20, God is now calling Moses up and he's speaking. And here's what he said: "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And I want to make sure that you notice two critical words. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. Would you say that with me? I am the Lord your, let's say it again. I am your. God didn't mince any words here. The relationship was firmly established on these principles. I am God, you are not, which made him Lord, master, boss, king, the one in charge. God is God, I am not. God is Lord, I am not. And with the relationship firmly established, then God delivered the boundaries, 10 of them. They're called the 10 Commandments. You will have no other gods. You will have no idols. You will not misuse my name. You will remember the Sabbath. You will keep it holy. You will honor your father and mother. You will not commit adultery. You will not commit murder. You will not steal. You will not lie. You will not covet. The rules are simple. They're stated in simple terms. There's no way you can misconstrue them, redefine them, turn them into something else. And if you read the passage, you'll notice there isn't any discussion about it either. It's not like God was putting any of this up for a vote. God said, here's who I am. This is our relationship. I'm God, I'm Lord, you're not. I'm Lord, you're God, and here's the boundaries, these 10 things. Now, if you read through the Old Testament, you know that all of this was a constant struggle for the children of Israel. The question was always, who is our God? Or who is our God going to be? That simple choice was Watershed. I mean, literally, it determined everything else. And is seen in an incident. I mean, we could pick out many moments in the Old Testament where they came to this fork in the road, but the one I want to put in front of you is just 1 year later. 1 year later at Kadesh Barnea. After a year at Mount Sinai, we've received the law, we've received the relationship and the boundaries of it. They got the instructions to build the tabernacle and get everything together. They put all of this together, and then God led them up to the promised land. And right when they got to the southern edge, the door in through the Negev, into the promised land, into Kadesh Barnea, God stopped the community, all 3 million of them. And 12 men were picked out, one from each tribe, and they were sent, these spies, into the promised land. God invited them to go into the land, check it out. Because you've been hearing for all these years what it's like. I want you to know exactly what is in front of you. And so the spies went in. And 40 days later, they came back. And when they came back with this report that began with joy. And that is, the land is everything that God said it was. It's a land that is flowing with milk and honey. I mean, they brought back produce, the pomegranates, the grapes. They brought it back. They laid it in front of the people. It was like an ooh and ah moment. And then they flipped the tables. They said, but as great, as amazing as the land is in its produce, it's a frighteningly horrifying place. And that's because the inhabitants of the land are something that we've never seen. We thought Egypt was fortified. These people here are living in fortified cities, and they have chariots of iron, and a bunch of them are giants. Remember Goliath in Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 17. A bunch of these people are giants. They're huge. We look like grasshoppers in their sight, and we look like that to them too. They could squish us like bugs. And when the people heard the report, their hearts melted. In spite of all that had happened over the previous year, it's like everybody's forgetting what went down, the plagues, the Red Sea, the army, the fact that God had fed these people for a year out in the middle of nowhere, providing famine and quail and then letting water come out of rocks. The vast miracles that went on around them because God provided, suddenly it was gone. The people set themselves up as the authority. We're going to listen to us. Here's what they said, we cannot do this. It was never God's intention for them to do it. It was God's intention that He was going to do it. And that's how their life had been over the last year. But now the people are saying, we can't do it. It was a watershed moment. As a result, God led them right back into the wilderness. Numbers chapter 14, verses 28 through 30 tells us that over the next 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies were in the land, that generation was going to die. Everybody 20 years and older would die in the wilderness. 2 million of them. A watershed moment, and it didn't end well. As 40 years later, after these 2 million people had died, that God brought the next generation back to the promised land, back to the edge of the promised land. Their kids, their grandkids are now the generation, the next 3 million people that are ready to enter in. And before they went into the land, Moses gathered them around, and he reminded them of what they had heard at Mount Sinai 40 years earlier. Now, we read all a bit about this in the book of Deuteronomy, and honestly, the book of Deuteronomy can best be summarized as a reminder. It's a reminder document. There's nothing new in Deuteronomy, nothing. It's clearly understood by the title of this book, Deuteronomy, Deuter 2, Namas, law, the second law. But don't hear it as like this is a new law, like the first one had failed, and so God was giving a new law, a second law. No, what's happening here is God is delivering the law through Moses a second time. It's a reminder. Everything that is said in the book of Deuteronomy has already been said. There's nothing new here. The purpose of this book is really simple. It's a calling of this new generation to commit themselves to God and obediently follow the ways of the Lord. The word reminder or remember appears 14 times. 8 times the Israelites are told, do not forget. 12 times the Israelites are told to listen. Over and over and over again. It's coming out. The book is a review. It's like a review for the big test. Moses clearly told the Israelites that success in their lives would happen if they chose God, chose to live according to obedience, to his commands. There are several pertinent points of application that appear in the book of Deuteronomy. And I'm just telling you, friends, it might have been written 3,000 years ago, but all of this is good for us. It's good for us to take it in. We are wise when we take it in. We're wise when we listen, when we heed. And as the book is winding down, there are 3 things I want you to note that Moses says. First, Moses calls the Israelites to obedience. Here we are, back to this word again. Deuteronomy 27:10, you shall therefore obey the voice of the Lord, your God, keeping his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. When I was a kid, there were times that I felt that I really didn't appreciate the rules of the house. Anybody else ever like that when you were growing up? Am I the only rebellious sot among us, right? Actually, I know you, so you're like me. The rules would be given. And there were times when I felt like I needed to go to my mom and my dad and explain life to them. Explain what really, this new generation thinks and how it's really going to work and what they really needed to do. Because I was convinced that my point of view was the right point of view and I needed to win the argument that day. My dad had an interesting way of responding to my flawed logic. More than one time, my dad told me, you really got 2 choices, son. You can die. Like right now, you could die, or you could jump. And on the way up, you could ask how high. So my dad is telling me when I speak, that's the command. When I speak, you move. And you're already moving if you have questions about the confines of this. In other words, my dad was calling me to obedience. If he spoke, that's the answer. There's nothing more to know. And really, friends, this is the bottom line of how we should live our relationship with God. If God is God, then it is my duty to simply obey. So many people want to have an argument with God. They want to have an argument with the Bible. They want to tell God what they agree with and what they disagree with. I think that command's ridiculous. I think I ought to be able to do this. I think that was written for a different age and a stage. We've grown, we've matured. Surely the Bible needs to change and come to status with where we are as a people now, because we're a lot smarter, we're a lot brighter than these poor, ignorant people that were roaming the earth all those years ago. God needs to conform to a new culture. God needs to spin it the way we see it. But that's not how the people of God respond. It's simple obedience. And Moses reminded them of this truth. Obey the voice of the Lord. Keep his commandments. Keep his statutes. Ask him how high on the way up. The second point of application that comes at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and that's Moses informing the Israelites that the choice was theirs and encourage them to choose life. I call heaven, Deuteronomy 30:19, I call heaven and earth to be a witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. Here's just the simple truth. You cannot live on the coattails of anybody else. Your relationship with God does not flow to another person. You can't drag anybody with you, and you can't be dragged along by anybody else. It's your choice about where you stand. It's your belief, your faith, your obedience. You can have a zillion excuses about why it isn't so or how it ought to be different, but in the end, it doesn't matter. At the end, you're going to stand before God, and you will give an account about what he said and what you did. Did you choose life? And I'm just telling you, friends, there are consequences. Consequences for your choices. I think it's written down in your notes. If not, write down Deuteronomy chapter 28 and go there and read the chapter. I mean, it's just laid out. If you follow me, you will be blessed. If you don't follow me, you will be cursed. Blessing, cursing. Consequence either way. Some of it very negative, some of it very positive. Read it and see. When you choose to obey, it flows to blessing. When you choose to thumb your nose at God and say no thanks, it will flow to a curse, to trouble. And yes, it's really that simple. Moses told the Israelites to take personal responsibility. Obey God. Choose to do that. And then Moses lays down one more thought. Moses commanded them to take responsibility to pass all of this on to the next generation. And when I say pass, I mean instill. This is more than just, writing something down and moving on. This is more than leaving a note. This is literally putting it in their heads and helping them see it, to model it, to live it. Pour into them. Take all of this information and commit to walking in these ways so that blessing can flow into your life, and then use that as a statement of example to your kids and your grandkids so that they will know how it works too. And listen, if you're going to give something, it means you already need to have it, because you are never going to be able to pass on to somebody else what you don't have, what you don't believe, what you don't follow. If your life is spent walking in disobedience to God, you cannot expect that your kids are going to find anything but that same road. Now, this passage in Deuteronomy starts with what we know as the Shema. Shema. In Hebrew, the word Shema means hear. Shema Yisrael. Hear Israel. Hear Israel. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This was a prayer that was uttered morning, noon, and night by every Jew. It was on their lips throughout the day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord is God. The Lord is one. And then the passage goes on. Deuteronomy 6:5 says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This being you have proclaimed as Lord, that you have proclaimed as God, is to be loved, worshiped, and adored with everything you have, with every part of your being. And then, Deuteronomy 6:6, these words I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Surround yourselves with this. Post it. Live it. And then everywhere you go, take opportunity to teach it to your kids. Pass it on. Take responsibility to have it in you, to live it in you, and then take responsibility to give it. Model for them a life of theism, that there is a God that needs to be obeyed. If you want your kids to walk this way, friends, parents, grandparents, help your kids out. This notion today that says, I'm just going to let my kids decide, hogwash. Your kids are listening to somebody tell them about life. And what God wants you to do is be the one that's going to tell them. So bring God's word into it. Obey it. Understand there's consequences to all of that. Live, model for your kids what a life of blessing is all about as you determine to choose life. And here's how Moses winds it all down. His reminder to this new generation of Israelites in Deuteronomy 32, for it is no empty word for you. I'm not, the last 32 chapters that I spoke are not empty. They're not vain. It's not willy-nilly. These are words. They are your very life. And they're all formed all the way back in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. I am the Lord, your God. Now, friends, the heart of theism is this simple definition. Solomon wrote it. Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. You want a straight path? Well, if you put it into your mind to find the straight path, you're going to be in trouble. So don't go looking anyplace else. Simply come to God and find God and follow his word, follow his instruction, follow his teaching, and that will be your straight path. And blessing will flow from that. These words come from Solomon, could have come from nobody better, because if anybody understood this, it was Solomon. Solomon started his life so well. In 1 Kings 3, God said, you can have whatever you want. And Solomon said, would you just give me wisdom so I can judge and be the king that you want me to be? And God blessed him abundantly with wisdom. And then just 8 chapters later in 1 Kings chapter 11, you're reading that this guy who says, I want to follow you and love you, give me wisdom to do that, is now violating the commands, and he's bringing in all these women from foreign nations. And not only that, these women he's marrying are bringing their gods with them. And now Solomon, who built the temple, is now building high places, temples for all these other gods. And Solomon is actually worshiping them and burning incense to these false gods. And his life fell off the cliff. It was a continental divide moment. It was a drive your stake moment in his life. It was a watershed. And as he gets down this road about as far away from God as you can possibly get, finally, he comes back to God at the end of his life. And he's reaching out to his kids, and he's writing the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Proverbs. They're written by an old king who's looking back and saying, I was way down the wrong roads, and my life has been miserable. Read Ecclesiastes. And now it's come back. And this is the call of God to his people, his creation. Point your life in my direction. Turn to me. Repent. Let a stake be driven in the heart of your life to choose me. Choose life. Theism. I choose to acknowledge that there is a God, and I will follow him. Now, in contrast to that, literally in juxtaposition of that, there's another word I want to put in front of you. We have theism. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's put the word humanism. Humanism is a system of belief that rejects God. It rejects God and it elevates human beings and their personal ability to solve all their problems and build a meaningful life. And if you read enough about this, you'll really see that if you give man enough time, he will build a utopian society. And I'm just telling you, every time I start reading about humanism and I just even see this little simple definition, I'm telling you, I start laughing to myself. Seriously, when has that ever happened? When have you ever put man in charge of anything by throwing God out and taking man's design and moving man's way and things got better? We're living in the midst of this right now. There is a group in our country and feverishly around the world who is doing everything they can do to get rid of Jesus, get rid of the Bible, get rid of the commands. Their thought is that we'll be better without him. To be freed from this thumb that lives on our lives. It's just make-believe anyway. And I'm just asking you, is it true? Are we better because we've kicked God out? Is 2020 better than 1950 because we did away with God? And the answer is no. Some of you are way too young to remember 1950. I'm just telling you, no. And yet, not surprisingly, human history is littered with man's attempt to be right here. It started right from the beginning. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 3. God has set down the rules in the garden. I am God, you are not. Adam and Eve, stay away from the tree. They had choice, the tree. And suddenly Satan is in there and he's tempting them. And here's the temptation. You can be God. God doesn't want you to eat of that tree because the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and enlightened and you will be like God, great. And they partook of it, and everything has never been the same ever since. Kill God, get rid of him? Bad choice. Now, here's the problem with humanism. Here's the problem. God is real. God is real. Come on, church, amen? God's real. And honestly, that has been the take of science and philosophy for most of history. For most of mankind's existence on this planet, since the creation of Adam, mankind has recognized that there is a God, that he exists, that he created, that we are subject to him, subject to his rules, and that we will be judged accordingly. Accepting the existence and the authority of God has always just been considered right, the thing to do, a wise thing to do. For thousands of years, science and philosophy taught that God is real. For thousands of years, science taught that God is worthy to be worshiped, the creator, the sustainer of life. And I've put a few passages into your notes here, and I'd encourage you to read them this afternoon because they're really so simple. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 23 is saying that God has plainly revealed himself in creation. If you just go outside and look, how can you come to any other conclusion? Psalm chapter 19, verse 1 and 3 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. So Psalm 14, verse 1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And so for thousands of years, everybody believed this. And then we came to November 24th, 1859. 160, almost 1 years ago. It's a date that lives in infamy. Why? Because on this date, Charles Darwin published a book entitled On the Origin of Species. 28 years earlier, December of 1831, the then 22-year-old Darwin got on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he sailed to South America. The purpose of the trip was to chart the coastline of South America. And while the men on the ship were doing the charting, Darwin was mostly ashore, and he was researching. He was investigating geology and making natural history collection. 5 years later, this boat returned home. And when it did, within 6 months of his return, Darwin was starting to speak out to some people around him. He was speculating about a new theory that was rattling around in his brain. The idea was that man wasn't created, man evolved. His idea was kind of that there was a cell, and that cell is the product of everything that is. The tree of life springs from the cell, and that we all spring from everything else. That every form of life, really, you could funnel it all back to this one beginning cell, that all of us are interconnected tissue with everything that is. It was 23 years later, the thoughts were written down in his now infamous book. And from that day forward, secular humanism, these scientists that were involved in this idea of humanism, believed they had the idea that they needed to throw God out. If all that is could have simply evolved, then there is no need for God. It really was that simple in their minds. Humanists believed they had the grain of thought that would give them exactly what they not only needed, but what they wanted. And from that date forward, science has been feverishly, and I mean feverishly, trying to prove that Darwin's theory was true. Now, let me just say this. Science has tunnel vision. Tunnel vision. Science is no longer seeking truth. The purpose of science now is to give credence to this theory. It's obsessed with its pursuit, so obsessed that anyone who stands in opposition to the theory is thrown out. If you've never read, or if you've never watched the movie Expelled, I would encourage you, go rent it. Go rent it or go buy it. I've watched it, and I mean, it just takes through about how scientists all across the realms are being thrown out because they're daring to say that what Darwin wrote is wrong. I just encourage you to check out your kids' and your grandkids' textbooks from their science classes in school. Do you find out anything about God? Is there anything about possible creation? No, none of that. The only thing that is taught is this broken down theory that's riddled with holes. The more science uncovers, the more there is determined proof that not only was there a beginning, which proves that there had to be a beginner, it also proves the earth, universe, human life could have never simply evolved by some blind process of mutation called evolution. You want a couple compelling books to read here? Let me just suggest two. They're by the same guy, Michael Behe. He's really not even claiming to be a Christian. The book, his first book was called Darwin's Black Box, and 13 years later he wrote Darwin Devolves. And these are just pictures from a scientist who has something that Darwin didn't have, which is an electron microscope. And if Darwin had had that, he would have thrown his theory out the window, because Darwin thought that the cell was something very simple, but it's not. It's this complex mechanism, which includes in every cell of your body your DNA. And if you've read any DNA, you know how complicated that is, but it's in every, where did it come from? This code, this genomic code that is being unleashed into people's minds is proving that we are complicated, that a cell is not simple. We couldn't have just evolved. What's really amazing to me is even by Darwin's own evaluation, his theory's been proven false. 160 years ago, Darwin said his theory would be proven right or wrong by the facts. And the facts that he said will be the fossil record. Because if what Darwin said was true, that everything evolved from this one cell, then everything is connected. And if everything is connected by this slow mutation over time, over millions and millions of years, then there's going to be all these intermediary forms. That if a fish becomes a lizard, that there's going to be a fish lizard someplace, or a lizard fish. And we're going to see in the fossil record all this intermediate activity. If a lizard becomes a bird, then we're going to see that because we're going to watch it in the fossil record over millions of years. The problem is we haven't found any of it. Scientists keep drawing pictures and they keep saying, well, this could be something. But every time they uncover something, it doesn't give any credence to any of this. And more, biology tells us it can't happen. A dog cannot become a cat. It's impossible. But we've morphed animals within their species. We have a new puppy in our house. It's a Cavapoo. It's a Cavalier King Charles poodle mix. It's a Cavapoo. When you put a Cavalier King Charles together with a poodle, what you really get is a goober. You know what I mean? But here's this animal. It's a dog. It's not half cat. It's not something else. We can morph things within a species, make it longer hair, make it a little bit bigger, make it a little bit stronger, but you can't ever take a dog and make it into a monkey. It can't happen. After 160 years of searching, the fossil record is missing all of the transitional links, but science is undeterred. It's spent the last 60 years propping up a broken down theory that even Darwin himself would have rejected. And sadly, it's led to a philosophy that's mired in a septic hole. Philosophy, the word means philos, love, Sophia, wisdom, philosophy, the love of wisdom. And if you've read philosophy, you know that's crazy because it's hardly the love of wisdom. Philosophy has brought the lie, propagated the myth that God is dead, and it's taken mankind to the eventual end of its road. It's what happens if there really truly is no God. If you've read some of this modern stuff, you know it's desperate and it's a trek straight to hell. Soren Kierkegaard was born just a couple of years after Darwin was born, and he was growing up through all of this as Darwin's making his propositions, and Kierkegaard is kind of coming to the same conclusion. There is no God, so therefore, and now his philosophical mind is moving that says if there is no God, well, then there's no rules. And if there are no rules, well, eventually he says there's no meaning. Because there isn't any meaning. If there's no God, if all we are is accidents on the planet, then there's no meaning. So here's Kierkegaard's solution that you need to find your own meaning. It's called existentialism. You find your own meaning, you find your own purpose. And yours is different than mine, and mine's different than yours, and we probably step over each other. We got to be careful here, but that's how it works. It's a couple of years later, like 35 years, that Nietzsche was born, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is the father of nihilism, and he just took Kierkegaard to the right conclusion, and that is forget all of that. If there's no God and there's no meaning, then life is a complete and total waste. If all we are is cosmic accidents, then here's Nietzsche's end of the road. Take a gun and blow your head off because it's the most noble thing to do. Your life is a joke. It's nothing but despair. It's what happens when you form this philosophy that says, I'm going to walk the way of the world. And friends, I'm telling you, theology follows closely behind. Look around. So many of the so-called people of God are rejecting the truth of God. They're rewriting the Bible. They've thrown out the commandments. They've made themselves the authority. Just go home this afternoon and read Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, and tell me that that doesn't describe our world, and in many cases, the church. Solomon had it right. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to the man, and the end it leads to death. Now, friends, these two competing philosophies, theism, there is a God, humanism, there is no God, form the continental divide of your life. And the way that you choose to turn is going to lead you in directions that are catastrophically different from each other. So here's my question to you this morning. What are you going to believe? Are you going to believe that there is a God with whom you must deal with, who's written commandments and who wants a relationship with you and has marked out a path? Or are you going to believe that we're nothing but an accident, that there is no God and you can do whatever you want to do? You have a choice. You can drive a stake. My question is, what stake are you going to drive? On what side of the line will you let your water shed? The water of your life. Because water is going to flow. And the choices you make do have consequences. There is a God, friends. He is real, He is true, He created, He spoke. And there's a day that is coming that we are going to stand in front of Him and give an account. No matter how you try to say it's not true, it is true. No matter how you try to blow off the commands so you can do what you want to do, you are not God. I am the Lord your God. Exodus 20, verse 2. I am the Lord your God. Would you say it with me? I am the Lord your God. Are we going to be politically correct? Or are we going to be biblically correct? Life, death. God's heart for you? Choose life. Bow your heads. Would you do that? And friends, this is our church. We have determined to choose life. God is our God. He is our Lord. The Bible is our book. And for that, we make no apologies. We're not going to be mean-spirited. We're not going to be angry. We're not going to be venomous. But truth is truth is truth is truth is truth. And the question this morning is, where do you land with that? Is God your God, or are you your God? It's a watershed decision. And so, Father, I pray that you'll help us to not take this lightly. The words need to go into our heart, they need to go into our minds, and they need to go deeply. That we not only acknowledge you as our God, but that we choose to obey you as our God, to follow the ways of life, to allow the consequence of joy and life and blessing to flow because you are good. And so, Father, help us to take it in, to drive the stake, and to declare, you are the Lord. You are God. You are my Lord. You are my God. Help us to that end, Father, is our prayer. We lift it in the name of Jesus. And God's people said,